The air in the mezzanine was thick, a costly blend of aged scotch, polished mahogany, and the synthetic scent of self-importance. It was the kind of money that didn't need to shout, but chose to anyway, vibrating off the crystal flutes and the overly zealous smiles plastered across faces that hadn't seen a moment of genuine hardship in 3 generations. In this ecosystem of inherited power and political backscratching, Sergeant Reynolds was deliberate camouflage, a ghost in a field of flash. She wasn't wearing standard issue, but the perfectly tailored midnight blue silk dress she chose was just as much a uniform, designed not to impress, but to disappear into the peripheral vision of the predators she was observing. She was a technical analyst tonight, tucked into the corner, nursing a mineral water that nobody noticed she wasn't replacing with champagne. She was, professionally, invisible, and that was precisely the problem for him. Major Alistair Thorne, the antagonist of the evening, was the auditory manifestation of entitlement. His laughter was a weapon, loud and uncontrolled, designed to halt nearby conversations and redirect attention to his own spectacular mediocrity. Thorne was draped over the bar, 3 deep into a whiskey neat, broadcasting his recent promotion, a desk job achievement, secured by pedigree and not by deployment, with the zeal of a conquering hero. He wore his dress uniform like a costume, pristine white gloves occasionally punctuating a self-congratulatory anecdote about a spreadsheet optimization that, in his mind, saved the entire fleet. Every time he pivoted, the gilded tassels of his shoulder boards caught the amber light, flashing a reminder of the rank he valued more than the men who died earning it. He caught sight of Reynolds across the room, not because she drew attention, but because his eyes, trained only to seek out subordinates or potential admirers, registered her lack of engagement. She was reading a dense technical manual, oddly bound in a plain brown cover, and the pure, unadulterated apathy she projected towards the entire establishment seemed to challenge his central thesis of being the most important person in the room. Thorne straightened, pushing off the bar with a theatrical movement, the kind a cheap actor uses to signal dominance. He approached Reynolds' corner, his gait slightly unsteady, powered by alcohol and unwarranted confidence. "Well, well, look what we have here," Thorne's voice boomed, forcing 2 nearby junior officers to instantly cease their low-key discussion about deployment rotation. The sound amplified off the marble flooring. "Sergeant Reynolds, isn't it? The little ghost of the SIGINT room." Reynolds did not immediately look up. This was her first critical move. She didn't flinch, didn't jump to attention, and didn't close the manual she was studying. She simply allowed her eyes to travel the remaining 5 lines of text on the page, the movement of her pupils precise and measured, before she performed the most threatening action an operator can undertake. She registered his presence with a calm, deliberate slowness that signaled a complete lack of fear. She placed a slender leather bookmark exactly where she'd stopped, closed the heavy manual with a silent thud that seemed immense in the sudden quiet, and then finally raised her gaze. Her eyes, steel gray and perfectly still, met his. There was nothing in them, no deference, no submission, no anger, just observation. The coldness was immediate, an Arctic blast in the overheated room. "Major Thorne," she acknowledged, her voice low, requiring him to lean slightly forward, stripping him of the advantage of volume. Thorne seemed momentarily thrown by her lack of immediate apology for existing. He recovered quickly, resorting to the tired joke he'd clearly rehearsed mentally. "Enjoying the party, Sergeant? Or are you calculating the optimal trajectory for that mineral water bottle to escape gravity?" He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound, inviting the surrounding officers to join the cheap mockery. "Seriously, Reynolds, put the book away. You look like you're waiting for the school bus. We're celebrating success tonight. We don't need the pallid atmosphere of tech support hanging around." He leaned in closer, invading her space, his expensive cologne suddenly cloying and aggressive. "You know, I asked Commander Peterson about you the other day. Technical genius, he says. Can hack the Russians while ordering a latte. But he also said you were stiff, a bit too serious for your own good. You need to relax, Sergeant. Learn the social graces that actually advance a career in this structure. Competence gets you noticed. Connections get you promoted, especially for someone of your limited background." The insult wasn't just about her rank. It was a dagger aimed at her perceived socioeconomic status, the implied knowledge that she hadn't come from the same elite military families as Thorne. Reynolds's face remained a mask of flawless indifference. But the observers, the junior officers who knew her reputation for solving problems others couldn't even define, knew what was coming. They recognized the stillness. A cobra doesn't hiss before striking. It just stops moving, absorbing all external energy into the coiled potential of the strike. "Understood, Major," Reynolds said, maintaining the low volume. "I am aware that my current duty profile often requires interaction with systems designed for high-level inefficiency. I apologize if my concentration appeared to violate the mandated atmosphere of celebratory self-congratulation." Her precision with language, turning his own bureaucratic jargon back on him, registered only as insolence to Thorne. He scoffed. "See? That's exactly what I mean. Too much jargon, too much seriousness. You need a little spice, Reynolds, a little humanity. You need to learn how to play the game." He gestured dismissively toward the crowd. "Go on. Go enjoy the dance floor. Get a drink that actually has alcohol in it. Go be a woman for 5 minutes, instead of a poorly disguised server rack." The air thickened further. The surrounding crowd, previously amused by Thorne's swagger, now felt the uncomfortable heat of true cruelty. Reynolds was not just being teased, she was being publicly reduced. And this, right here, was the pivot point. The slow burn was reaching the ignition temperature. Reynolds took a long, slow sip of her mineral water, finishing the glass. She placed it back on the coaster with a delicacy that felt monumental. Every millimeter of the movement weighted with intent. Then she fixed Thorne with that deadly, empty gaze. "The game you speak of, Major," she replied, her voice dropping another octave, now almost a whisper that still managed to carry, "is one I stopped playing when the rules changed from meritocracy to survival." Thorne missed the warning. He saw only a low-ranking officer attempting a weak philosophical rebuttal. "Oh, a philosopher now? Look, Sergeant, you're good at pushing buttons, but those buttons are electronic. Some of us push buttons that launch ships. Big difference. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go speak to the colonel about my transfer package." He started to turn, attempting to end the interaction on his terms, feeling he had successfully put the ghost back in her corner. But Reynolds wasn't finished. The execution of a critical tactical objective is rarely loud. It is precise. "Major Thorne," she stated, and this time she didn't whisper. She spoke with the calibrated resonance of a command override. "Your transfer package was revoked at 1830 hours, and the inefficiency in the fleet wasn't due to bad spreadsheets. It was due to the compromised integrity of the encrypted telemetry data you were responsible for verifying before it was transmitted to HQ." Thorne froze mid-pivot. The laughter around the bar instantly evaporated. The silence was absolute, heavy, pressurized. What are you talking about, Reynolds?" Thorne stammered, his face losing its healthy, alcohol-induced flush. "I'm talking about the 270 gigabytes of unverified ghost data that routed through your terminal last week. Data that looked perfect to your automated checks, but was a zero-day insertion point for a hostile entity. I flagged it. I isolated it. I reported it. And I ensured that General Petrovsky was aware that the failure stemmed directly from the human element responsible for manual oversight. Your signature, Major." Thorne's breathing became ragged. This was no longer a social slight. This was a professional execution. But he still clung to his rank, his ingrained belief in the protective power of his family name. You can't possibly know that," he hissed, trying desperately to recapture the narrative. "That information is classified above your pay grade, Sergeant. You're lying to save face." Reynolds simply smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator checking its trap. "I know the exact SHA-256 hash of the payload, Major." "Do you?" She paused, letting the impossible question hang there. "No, of course not. That's because I spent 72 hours isolating the vector while you were attending an exclusive golf event that was, ironically, the precise location the foreign state actor was tracking you from. They weren't after the ships, Major. They were after your credentials. And you gave them away with a simple, unencrypted email regarding your tea time." He staggered backward a step, the whiskey finally catching up to the adrenaline crash. "I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination and the spreading of classified falsehoods," Thorne sputtered, pointing a shaking finger. Before Reynolds could respond, a new, massive presence entered the scene. General Anton Petrovsky, a man whose reputation was carved into the granite history of the Corps, a man with genuine blood on his boots and stars on his shoulders that were earned in the field, not the office, walked directly to their corner. Petrovsky was known for his distaste for pretension. He didn't look at Thorne. He looked only at Reynolds. "Sergeant Reynolds," Petrovsky said, his voice a deep rumble that commanded immediate attention throughout the room. He didn't bark the rank. He spoke it with respect. "I apologize for the delay in processing the transfer request. I was confirming the final audit trail on the data breach. Thank you for handling the containment so discreetly. You prevented a catastrophic loss of asset integrity." He reached not for Thorne's trembling hand, but for Reynolds's empty mineral water glass. He took a bottle of 18-year-old single malt from a passing waiter's tray, a bottle reserved only for the very highest echelon, and poured a generous measure into her glass. "Please accept this, Sergeant," Petrovsky said, handing the whiskey back to her. "This is the reward for true competence. Drink it slow. You earned the entire bottle." The room was now utterly silent, watching the general of the fleet serve a technical sergeant a drink while a major stood paralyzed, accused of treasonous incompetence. The power had shifted entirely, not with a loud decree, but with the quiet act of pouring whiskey. Thorne, now seeing his entire career dissolving into the high-end carpet fibers, tried one last desperate grasp at authority. "General, sir, this sergeant is fabricating charges. I demand a hearing. Her credentials must be scrutinized. She has a history, a questionable past. I heard rumors she wasn't even standard entry. Look at her, sir. She doesn't fit in." Petrovsky finally turned his head, slowly towards Thorne. His expression was one of profound disappointment. "Major Thorne," the general said, his voice chilling, "you are relieved of all duties, effective immediately. Your conduct tonight, in addition to your negligence in the SIGINT failure, demonstrates a terminal lack of judgment and professional integrity. The shore patrol is waiting for you at the entrance." Petrovsky turned back to Reynolds, giving Thorne the final humiliating dismissal of his gaze. "Sergeant," Petrovsky continued, "take the rest of the evening, and tomorrow you need rest." Reynolds nodded, the coldness in her eyes finally softening slightly, accepting the validation she neither sought nor required, but which was, finally, delivered. This exchange, however, was only the prologue, the true core of Reynolds's identity, the source of the deadly competence that allowed her to move like a ghost and strike like a viper, was a story written not in digital code, but in scar tissue. Later that week, the atmosphere was drastically different. The sterile, white-tiled bathroom of an exclusive rooftop club, a place that screamed expense but lacked warmth, served as the next stage. It was a fundraising gala for a veterans' charity, ironically attended mostly by those who benefited from the concept of military sacrifice, rather than participating in it. Reynolds was attending reluctantly, mandated by the general to provide a humanizing face for the technical division. She was wearing a different dress, this one deliberately chosen for the optics, a high neck in the front, but cut deep in the back, exposing the entirety of her upper spine and the slope of her shoulders. She felt naked, vulnerable, and profoundly uncomfortable. The dress was a strategic mistake made under duress. She was applying lipstick, her movements economical and precise, when two women, wives of defense contractors dripping in diamonds and disdain, entered the washroom, carrying an aura of privileged annoyance. They immediately noticed Reynolds, or rather, they noticed the mark. The mark wasn't subtle. It was a wide, chaotic patch of skin stretching across her left scapula and upper back, puckered and uneven. It was not the clean line of a surgical repair or the smooth geometry of a traditional tattoo. It looked haphazard, almost like melted rubber, fading from dark charcoal at the center to a mottled pink at the edges. "Oh my heavens, Brenda," whispered one woman, loud enough to ensure Reynolds heard, as they stopped at the adjacent mirror. "Did you see that?" Brenda adjusted a massive diamond choker. "It's appalling, isn't it? I mean, if you insist on getting some kind of ugly, abstract back piece, at least pay for a decent artist. That looks like she fell asleep on a branding iron at a biker rally." The first woman giggled, a shrill, brittle sound. "It's probably some kind of rebellious prison ink, trying to look edgy. But darling, if you're going to spend $3,000 on a silk gown, the least you can do is cover up that hideous mistake." They continued to critique her body as if she were an inanimate object, a sculpture poorly maintained. They laughed, a delicate yet devastating form of social execution. Reynolds felt the familiar cold pressure building behind her eyes. This was the precise sensation that preceded extreme violence. But she was in a crowd, in civilian clothes, and these were civilian fools. She had to swallow the impulse to demonstrate precisely how non-rebellious that prison ink truly was. She slowly capped her lipstick, taking deep, measured breaths. Perhaps it's just a terrible burn scar she never had properly treated, Brenda offered, trying to sound charitable but failing spectacularly. Tragic, really. She should hire a dermatologist, or perhaps stick to turtlenecks. Reynolds turned from the mirror, intending to simply walk out, to allow their shallow words to dissipate into the expensive vapor of the room. She was halfway to the door when a third person entered the room. He wasn't a contractor or a politician. He was clearly military, but older, wearing a civilian tuxedo that couldn't quite conceal the width of his shoulders or the disciplined rigidity of his posture. He had silver hair cropped close to the scalp, and eyes that looked like they'd been bleached by staring at distant explosions. This was Colonel Marcus Vance, retired, a legend in special operations circles, now running the charity foundation. Vance entered the washroom, scanning the room, an old habit, and his gaze settled instantly on Reynolds. He saw the gown, the posture, and then, inevitably, the mark. Vance stopped moving, not just physically, but his entire aura stilled. He saw the mark, and his breath hitched, a sharp, ragged intake of air that was louder than the contractors' wives gossiping. The women, sensing the colonel's unexpected entry, silenced themselves, suddenly concerned about the appropriateness of their conversation. Vance walked towards Reynolds, his movement no longer smooth, but slightly hesitant, powered by a disbelief that was rapidly turning into grim recognition. He didn't speak to the women. He didn't speak to Reynolds's face. He spoke directly to the mark, his voice stripped bare of rank or decorum, rough with history. "My God," Vance whispered, leaning in slightly, his eyes tracing the uneven texture of the scar tissue. He raised a hand, stopping short of touching her. Is that the Red Skull?" The women exchanged confused, slightly frightened glances. Red Skull? Was that a gang? Reynolds looked over her shoulder, confirming the exact pattern of the mark in the reflection. She nodded once, a quick, almost imperceptible confirmation. Vance straightened, the color draining from his face, leaving behind the pale, weathered mask of deep shock. He finally met Reynolds's gaze, and now, he didn't see a poorly dressed technical sergeant or a young woman at a gala. He saw a specter. "I only heard stories," Vance continued, his voice now addressing the women, but primarily the room, the volume rising slowly, deliberately, reclaiming the atmosphere. "Stories about that pattern. We thought they were myths, or exaggeration from intelligence officers who hadn't seen enough real action." He pointed a shaking finger at the mottled scar tissue on Reynolds's shoulder blade. "That is not a tattoo. That is not a parlor mistake. That is the calling card of the D11 interrogation protocol. Specifically, the field unit led by General Borov, the butcher of the Carpathians. They used a combination of sustained thermal and chemical application to create this pattern." He paused, letting the clinical cruelty of the description sink in. The contractors' wives were frozen, their faces turning from snobbish amusement to dawning horror. "They didn't just burn you once," Vance stated, his voice now hard as ice. "They used a solvent to prevent the tissue from setting properly, so when they reapplied the heat, it would spread and deepen the scar, preventing any form of clean healing or later removal. They did it in stages. It was designed not to kill, but to break the subject's will slowly, publicly, permanently." He looked back at Reynolds. "The Red Skull pattern wasn't random. It was a map. It's what they did to political prisoners who refused to name names during the darkest days of the last conflict. It was assigned to others. We broke this one. We branded this one. And the rumor was, if you received that mark and survived the camp, you were considered unbreakable. You had the intelligence they needed, but the will they couldn't crush." Vance stepped back, his posture now rigid, a salute performed without raising an arm. He looked at Reynolds with a reverence that was absolute, terrifying. "Sergeant Reynolds," Vance stated, using her rank with utmost respect, "I have reviewed hundreds of after-action reports and interrogation briefs in my career. I know the names of the few who were rumored to have walked out with the skull intact. They were the legends. You were a civilian asset they turned, weren't you? Deep cover, captured, tortured, and you gave them nothing." He finally looked at the two society women, his eyes blazing with fury. "You two pathetic creatures," Vance spat, his voice laced with utter contempt. "You look at this woman, who endured a process designed to strip away everything human and survived it, and you critique the aesthetics of her sacrifice? That mark is a medal of honor, etched in pain, worn on the skin. It cost more than all the diamonds you wear combined. She is wearing the proof that she can withstand anything you can imagine, and everything you can't. You look at a survivor of a war zone you only read about, and you call her, Mark, hideous. The atmosphere had transformed from a petty social conflict into a brutal, humiliating reckoning. The women were pale, clutching their purses, realizing they hadn't just insulted a stranger. They had insulted a warrior marked by the fires of hell in front of a living military legend. Their earlier laughter was now a sickening echo of privilege and ignorance. "Get out," Vance commanded, his voice barely above a growl. "Get out of here and spend the rest of your night contemplating the true cost of the freedom you so arrogantly flaunt." The two women fled the washroom in absolute silence, stumbling over their heels in their haste, the sound of their departure swallowed by the overwhelming quiet. Reynolds watched them go. The coldness in her eyes returned, but this time it was aimed inward. The exposure of the mark, the thing she tried so hard to keep hidden, had stripped her armor, but it had also, unexpectedly, armed her with the respect of a true veteran. Vance turned back to Reynolds, his face etched with sorrow. "I should have known," he murmured. "The profile, the technical genius, the coldness. It takes a certain kind of fire to forge that kind of steel, Sergeant." Reynolds gave another small, curt nod. "It's why I prefer working with machines, Colonel. Machines don't judge the casing, they just analyze the function." Vance understood immediately. He straightened his tuxedo jacket. "Understood, Sergeant. Go back to the shadows. And thank you. For your service. For your silence." The narrative shifts again a few days later, bringing us back to the primary conflict, now fueled by the raw humiliation Major Thorne suffered and the unexpected revelation of Reynolds's true depth. Thorne was not charged with treason, but his career was surgically dissected and neutralized. He was relegated to a forgotten storage facility on the edge of the base, managing retired inventory, the professional equivalent of death. The shame festered. He knew Reynolds had done this to him, not by brute force, but by quiet, surgical application of truth. He saw her everywhere, a haunting presence of his own failure. He finally cornered her in a supply depot. It was late. The place smelled of rust and ozone, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a depressing lack of energy. Reynolds was doing a standard inventory check, wearing simple fatigues, her hair pulled back tightly. The lack of social pretense, the bare reality of the military grind, gave Thorne a twisted sense of false superiority. He blocked her path between two stacks of heavy, sealed crates. "Still counting paper clips, Sergeant?" Thorne sneered, his voice low, shaking with restrained fury. He smelled faintly of cheap, desperate liquor. Reynolds looked up from her clipboard. She didn't show surprise. She had been expecting him. The trap was set for his aggression. "Major Thorne," she stated flatly, checking his name off an invisible list. "You are currently in a restricted zone without the proper clearance codes. Your presence here constitutes a violation of Regulation 37 Alpha. "Oh, spare me the regulations, Reynolds," he burst out, his face contorted. "You destroyed me. You took everything I worked for, everything my family earned for me, and you turned me into a joke, a warehouse clerk. Why? Because you were jealous of my rank, of my life?" He jabbed a finger aggressively towards her chest. The movement was fast, clumsy, and entirely predictable. Reynolds didn't flinch. She observed the action, categorizing it. Aggressive posturing, predictable trajectory. "I didn't destroy you, Major," she corrected, her voice dangerously calm. "Your negligence destroyed you. I merely documented the structural failure. And all this talk about some deep-cover torture mark?" Thorne scoffed, dismissing the story he hadn't witnessed but had heard, distorted by rumor. "A bunch of old men talking about old wars. It's all a fabricated past to give you credibility. You're just a glorified technician who got lucky once. You think you're better than me because some geriatric colonel served you a drink?" He stepped closer, invading the critical distance. "I want you to admit it, Sergeant. Admit that you manipulated the audit trail to get me busted down. Admit that the Red Skull story is bunk, that you're nothing special. You're just a cold little girl hiding behind a keyboard." This was the perfect moment. Reynolds closed her clipboard, the sound of the metal clasp echoing unnaturally loud in the silent warehouse. She looked him dead in the eye, and the chilling coldness intensified, becoming truly glacial. She performed the micro-movement of adjusting the collar of her uniform jacket, a quick, precise touch. "I have no interest in your manufactured reality, Major," she replied. "But since you are questioning my qualifications to judge your competence, Let me offer you one piece of classified information that proves my utility. She leaned in, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of copper and gunpowder clinging to her uniform, a scent that only veterans recognize. She didn't shout a command. She whispered 5 words, a rhythmic cadence of syllables that sounded like gibberish to an outsider, but which represented the deepest, most compartmentalized protocol in the Corps. Omaha, Bluebird, 4-7, Delta. Thorne's eyes went wide. The whispered words were a tactical decryption code known only to a handful of highly specialized combat operators and the general staff. It was a code used for deep target extraction, a designation that had only been activated twice in the last decade. It was the password for a Black Ops clearance level that was theoretically invisible to his entire former rank structure. How do you know that? Thorne whispered, the blood draining from his face once more. This was not rumor. This was verifiable, active intelligence. I know it, Major, Reynolds said, her voice dropping back to the silent, deadly pitch, because Bluebird 4-7 Delta was the designation for the field asset I extracted from the Krasnik sector 5 months ago. The asset that was being interrogated by General Borov, the man who invented the Red Skull Protocol. The connection slammed into Thorne with the force of a train wreck. The Red Skull was not just history. It was recent, traumatic, and connected to her. I was the technical advisor on that mission, Major, Reynolds continued, allowing the truth to unfold in slow-motion agony for him. My primary function was not counting paperclips. It was providing real-time, encrypted tactical guidance to the 3-man wet work team in the ground, coordinating their exfil route around hostile signals intelligence, all while maintaining absolute communications silence. And that ugly abstract back piece you mocked? It's not a mark of a victim. It's the physical neurological map I utilized to predict Borov's next move, because I knew how his torture protocols worked firsthand. She took another precise step toward him, forcing him to press himself against the crates. You believe rank gives you power, Major. I believe knowledge gives you power, and I know precisely how much of a threat you are to national security, which is exactly 0. You are a predictable variable. You're a noisy signal in a silent theater. She reached up, a quick, almost imperceptible movement, and her hand pressed into the inner pocket of his jacket, brushing against the silk lining. Thorne panicked. What are you doing? Get off me! Too late, Reynolds stated, pulling her hand away. In her palm, held between 2 fingers, was a small, perfectly cylindrical object, a passive tracking device the size of a grain of rice, designed to mimic a fiber speck, pulled from the lining of his uniform. She crushed it between her thumb and forefinger, reducing the expensive microtech to silent powder. That was the 3rd active tracker I've removed from your person since the general relieved you of duty, Reynolds informed him clinically. You are sloppy, Major. You are desperate, and you continue to demonstrate a willingness to compromise operational security simply because your ego cannot accept a demotion. You are now officially a liability, not just due to incompetence, but due to willful malice. Thorne gasped for air, leaning his head back against the cold metal crate. His chest was heaving. He realized the depth of the hole he had dug. He hadn't just mocked a technical sergeant. He had targeted a deep cover operator, a ghost who was currently running counterintelligence against him. I didn't mean to. I was just looking for answers, he pleaded, the arrogance entirely gone, replaced by raw, humiliating fear. Reynolds looked at the crushed dust of the tracker on her fingertips. She flicked the powder to the floor with a tiny, dismissive gesture. You won't find answers here, Major. Only consequences. She stepped around him, her movement fluid, silent, every muscle coiled and ready. As she passed, she paused just long enough to deliver the final word, the sentence of his professional and personal doom. The general knows, Major. He didn't serve me that whiskey for fun. He served it because he knew I had just finished cleaning up your mess. And now he knows you are still actively attempting to subvert the protective mechanisms we put in place. Your retirement forms are being processed, but your security clearance is gone. You are completely unplugged, and if I see you within 100 yards of any active military installation, your next conversation will be with someone who cares less about your family name than I do. She walked away, not running, not rushing, just walking with the steady, measured gait of someone who had won the war before the first shot was fired. The fluorescent lights hummed above Thorne, casting a sickly yellow glow on his defeated posture. He was standing in a warehouse of forgotten materials, himself now the most thoroughly forgotten of all. The silence she left behind was total, absolute, and utterly crushing. She never looked back. The lesson was delivered. The operation was complete. Respect is not an entitlement you inherit. It is a currency you earn in the darkest places on earth. And Sergeant Reynolds was covered in the indelible proof of her payment. She stepped out into the cool night air, adjusted her collar one last time, and disappeared into the shadows, the silence of her departure more intimidating than any explosion. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.